Mnemonics are clever memory techniques you can use to learn and remember more, but this doesn't mean that you should always use them. If you do, you will end up spending more time on mnemonics than you do engaging with the Chinese language. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about mnemonics, and more specifically, we're going to talk about the limits of mnemonics and why you shouldn't use them all the time. Before we get to the limits of mnemonics though, I want to talk about what mnemonics are and how they can be used to learn Chinese characters. This is not a topic I've covered in depth on the podcast before, so rather than counting on all of you knowing what mnemonics are and their power when it comes to learning Chinese characters, I will briefly go through how they can be used before we talk about the limits and why you shouldn't use them all the time. So let's start with a few observations and insights about learning Chinese characters. The first one is that while you can learn Chinese characters by rote, and by rote here means largely through repetition without really understanding what you're doing, this is very inefficient and not very practical for adult language learners because we don't have the time to immerse in the written language to the same extent that Chinese people have when they grow up and go to school. In essence, trying to learn Chinese characters as a jumble of strokes you repeat over and over is doomed to fail. It might work for your first dozen characters or so, and maybe you can learn 100 or maybe even a few hundred this way. But if you plan to become literate in Chinese and want to learn thousands of characters, this approach will be terribly frustrating and ultimately futile. What you need to do instead is to break characters down into components and then learn these components and how they are combined. This essentially changes the task of learning Chinese characters from memorizing thousands of pictures or pictograms into memorizing a few hundred of these and then combining them in different ways to form the actual characters. Superficially, these tasks might seem similar, but combining things you already know is a lot easier than learning completely new things. If you're new to learning Chinese and don't really know what I'm talking about here when it comes to components and how they form compounds and so on, I suggest that you check out episode 54, which is the first part in a series about the building blocks of Chinese. So let's get back to how to learn and remember Chinese characters. There are essentially two methods that you can use to boost your learning, and they are not mutually exclusive, so you can use both at the same time or just one depending on what you prefer. The first method is to understand the compound. Why does it look the way it does? How was it formed? Which are the components and how do they fit together? This requires you to look things up, but fortunately Outlier Linguistics have already done the research for you, so if you check out their Dictionary of Chinese Characters, you can easily see how compounds are formed, what the different parts in those compounds are doing, and the origins of the characters. Often, this understanding is enough in itself. The character makes sense, it is no longer a jumble of strokes, and that makes it much easier to both learn and remember. Another method is mnemonics. So a mnemonic is essentially a memory technique that can be employed to memorize anything, but here we are talking about Chinese characters. Mnemonics are very powerful when it comes to combining things you already know and remembering these combinations, so applying them on Chinese characters seems to make a lot of sense. And it does, but as I said in the intro, this doesn't mean that you should use them all the time. I've written a lot about mnemonics on Hacking Chinese, and I will make sure to put links in the show notes. But for example, in my beginner course, Unlocking Chinese, I talk about the writing system and how you can leverage mnemonics to learn characters. In Hacking Chinese, a practical guide to learning Mandarin, one of my other courses, not for beginners, I also talk about the principles of memory and how you can make sure to remember all the characters that you learn. The basic idea is that our brains are very good at noticing things that stand out and are unusual in different ways. It could be that they are bizarre, unusual, disgusting, or something like that. So if you combine two things that you want to remember in a bizarre way, you are much more likely to remember them than if you do so in a mundane way. So for example, if you want to memorize how to write the character for ocean in Chinese, yang, all you need to do is to combine the components in a memorable way. The components here are water and sheep, so maybe you can think of a giant sheep wading across the Atlantic Ocean with its wool all dripping wet. Feel free to add things that make the scene more bizarre and more memorable. So for example, if you're memorizing the character for mother in Chinese, don't think of a woman riding a horse or your mother riding a horse. Reverse the roles and have the horse riding your mother instead. I don't know which type of mnemonic works best for you as an individual, but by experimenting, you can figure this out rather easily. Essentially, learn the building blocks of characters and then try to combine them in memorable ways. Those combinations that you forget probably rely on principles that don't work very well for you, or you just need to learn more about how to apply them. And if you do this every time you encounter a difficult character, you will have plenty of opportunity to practice. Now, as I mentioned initially, the point of this episode is not to sing the praises of mnemonics, but rather to talk about their limitations. It's easy to get carried away by mnemonics when you realize how powerful they are and how much you can learn with them, but like I said also, this doesn't mean that you should use them all the time. In fact, you can't use them to learn everything. The reason for this is quite simple, because when you're memorizing a Chinese character, there are so many different things to memorize, and if you were to encode all of those in a picture or in a story of some kind, that story or picture would be so complex you end up spending almost all your time creating these mnemonics, which is not wise, because most of your time should actually be spent on reading Chinese and listening to Chinese, not coming up with creative stories. If your primary goal with learning Chinese characters is to figure out how your memory works, then this would indeed maybe be a good idea, but I assume that most listeners don't have that as their primary goal. The goal is to get better at Chinese, and you get better by engaging with the language, not by making up fancy stories. When you encounter a compound character in Chinese, there are so many things you need to learn, and so you need to choose which of these, if any, you're going to use mnemonics for. For example, you need to know what the character means, and that also includes additional meanings beyond the basic one. You need to know how the character is pronounced, the initial, the final, and the tone, and also including various alternate readings and pronunciations that can sometimes also be linked to different meanings in more or less complex ways. You also need to know the components, the building blocks, and how they are positioned relative to each other, and perhaps more importantly, how they are written. Like I said, if you try to encode everything that I've just mentioned into one single image or one single story, this is a complex challenge in itself and highly impractical if you were to apply it to every single character you want to know. The best solution to this problem is to only use mnemonics when you need them. For example, if you keep forgetting the tone of a character, create a mnemonic that includes the tone. And I've discussed how to do that in an article specifically about extending mnemonics to cover tones, initials, and finals, link in the show notes. But essentially what you can do is to take each of the 4 tones and associate them with an element, and then incorporate that element into your story or image. So to illustrate, we have the character ma, meaning mother. The first tone is usually depicted as being red in most color schemes, and so I associate it with fire. So if you set the whole scene on fire, this means that it is a first tone. So if you need to recall which tone it is later, you can use this mnemonic to recall that information. Naturally, it's impractical to do that in a conversation because the process will be too slow, which is a problem I talked about in episode 9. Similarly, if you forget a component in a character, or maybe the relative position of 2 components, create mnemonics that cover these things, and this is something I will return to later in this episode. The point I want to make here, though, is that if you don't forget the tone, don't create a mnemonic for it, and if you don't forget this particular component, there is no reason to encode it in a complex story that tries to capture all the information you need to know about this character. So what I'm saying here is that you should use mnemonics only when you need them. You might then ask what to do instead, and remember I did talk about 2 methods for learning characters, and the other one was to thoroughly understand the character, and often that is actually enough. As a beginner, you will find it difficult to learn Chinese characters based on simply understanding the writing system, but the more you learn about it, the easier this will get. So if you rely on mnemonics a little bit more as a beginner, that's perfectly fine. But you'll find that as an advanced student, you can often use patterns in the written language to figure things out and use that as an aid to remember how to write characters. Let's look at the most important example of this to show you what I mean, and that is phonetic components in Chinese characters. We already talked about the character meaning mother, ma, that consists of woman and horse. And the horse here has nothing to do with the meaning. Mother and horse are completely unrelated here, and the only reason we have the character for horse in the character for mother is that they happen to be pronounced the same, although with a different tone. So horse is ma with a third tone, and mother is ma with a first tone. And assuming that you know the components and spot the pattern with the phonetic component here, this is usually enough to learn this character. Like I said, maybe not this particular character, because it might be among the first 100 you learn or so, but when you encounter your 1000th character and you spot something that looks like a phonetic component and then a semantic component, this can sometimes be enough to remember the character on its own. I'm going to cherry pick an example here just to show you. There is a character which is very rare and you're unlikely to see it in any text that you read, but I bet if I ask you a year from now what it means, you will still remember it only based on the principle of phonetic component plus semantic component. The character in question is li, which means nautical mile, and it consists of water, the semantic component, on the left, and li, meaning mile, on the right, which is presumably both a phonetic and a semantic component in this character. Not all compounds are this easy to remember, but what I want to show you here is that understanding the writing system helps immensely, and combined with lots of reading, you might be able to remember most characters without using fancy mnemonics. Or if you use mnemonics, it will be to recall a specific aspect of the character, not everything there is to know about it. If you want to learn a lot more about the Chinese writing system, I refer to Outlier Linguistics again and their Chinese Character Masterclass. And this is a course that I've reviewed on Hacking Chinese, and I'll put a link in the show notes. If you're a beginner and want a softer start, I can also recommend the character course that I helped build for Skritter, which is available to subscribers, but this includes the free trial, so you can sign up and check out the course and then decide what you want to do. In general, try to be pragmatic. If the etymology of the character really helps you learn it, then use that. And if you think it's not helpful, then ignore it and make something up that sticks in your mind for some other reason. What I'm saying here is that you shouldn't just stick to one of the approaches by default and think it's the only way. You don't have to create mnemonics for all characters you know, and you certainly don't need to understand the etymology of all the characters that you know either. You can combine these two, or sometimes just rely on rote memorization as well. It depends on what character it is and what works for you. Before wrapping up this episode, I want to talk about something that sometimes can require using mnemonics and sometimes doesn't, namely the relative position of components. In many characters, this is obvious, or there are very strong patterns in the written language that you will figure out and can rely on to know where each component is supposed to go. The reason I bring this up is because when, for example, I describe the sheep walking across the Pacific Ocean, that only tells you that you have water and sheep and that it means ocean. It doesn't tell you in which order you're supposed to write these. You could imagine writing the sheep at the top and water at the bottom, maybe the reverse, and the water could maybe be on the left or right. As it happens though, almost all characters that have water as a semantic component has this component on the left, and this is no exception. So in other words, it's 3 drops of water and then sheep. This type of information is usually overkill to include in a mnemonic for the simple reason that it's given by the writing system, or because you simply will feel which one is right. If you've seen this character 100 times, you will probably not put water on the right. Again though, if this is something you do end up forgetting, then maybe you should include it in the mnemonic in some way. There are some treacherous building blocks in Chinese which are very hard to predict where they end up in a character. My favorite example is niao, bird, that is included in lots of different bird names, and it's almost impossible to know where it's supposed to be. It is usually on the right, but sometimes it's also on the left for some reason, and sometimes it's also on the bottom. I don't think there are any bird names where the niao is at the top, but maybe I've missed one. There's also a set of characters that have the same components but arranged differently and thus forming completely different characters. Just to give you one example, we have the character zhong, meaning loyal, which has the character for center at the top and then heart at the bottom. But then we also have the character chong, which means grieved, and it also has a heart now on the left and still middle now on the right. If you keep mixing up the order of the components in characters like these, then that's of course something you should definitely include in a mnemonic. I wrote an article on hacking Chinese a few years ago where I tried to collect all the characters that share the same components but are still different, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes if you're interested. I would say these are exceptions though. There are very few cases where I've found it necessary to include the relative position of the components in my mnemonics. Still, we're all different. Maybe you struggle with the relative position and want to use mnemonics for that, then that's fine. Maybe you find it's overkill to use mnemonics for something I use it for, and that is okay too. So in conclusion, don't use mnemonics for everything. This is massive overkill and you will end up spending all your time on mnemonics and no time on Chinese. If you want to kill a chicken, don't use a nuke. It will cause a lot of collateral damage, and it's a waste of resources you could have invested elsewhere. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.